The blood on Clara Brennan's lip tasted like copper and shame, but it was the sound of her father's belt hitting the wooden floor that made her flinch harder than any blow he had delivered. She lay curled on the rough planks of their farmhouse kitchen outside Abilene, Horace, Kansas. In the spring of 1878, her cheek pressed against wood that still smelled of lye soap from her morning cleaning. Through swollen eyes, she watched her father's boots pace back and forth, each heavy step making the floorboards creak with judgment. "You will marry Charles Whitmore," her father said, his voice shaking with an anger she had never heard before, not even when the drought had taken half their wheat 2 summers back. "His father owns the bank that holds the deed to this farm, girl. You think your stubborn pride is worth more than your family's survival?" Clara tried to speak, but her split lip made the words come out wrong. She was 22 years old enough to have her own thoughts about who she would spend her life with, but in this house, her age meant nothing. Charles Whitmore was a soft-handed man of 25 who had never worked a day in his life, who looked at her like she was a mare he was considering purchasing. The thought of his hands on her, of waking up next to him every morning for the rest of her life, made her stomach turn more violently than any beating could. "I would rather die," she whispered, and even as she said it, she knew it was the wrong thing to say. Her father's face went purple. "Then maybe you should," he said, and walked out, slamming the door so hard that dust rained down from the ceiling beams. Clara lay there as the sun moved across the floor, painting golden rectangles that slowly faded to gray. Her mother did not come to check on her. Her younger brother did not peek around the door frame with worried eyes. She was alone with her choice and its consequences, and for the first time in her life she understood that sometimes love within a family had conditions she could not meet. When darkness fell, she managed to pull herself up to sitting, then to standing. Every muscle in her body screamed protest. She made it to the water basin and looked at her reflection in the small mirror hanging above it. Her left eye was swelling shut, and there was a cut on her cheekbone that would probably scar. Her dark hair had come loose from its braid and hung in tangled waves around her shoulders. She looked like something broken, and maybe she was. She did not hear the rider approach. She did not hear the knock on the door or her father's gruff voice answering it. She only became aware that something was happening when her father called her name in a tone that was half command, half uncertainty. Clara walked to the front room, each step a small agony. Her father stood in the doorway, blocking most of her view of whoever stood on the porch. All she could see was the dark shape of a man in a wide-brimmed hat, silhouetted against the purple evening sky. "This man says he has business with you," her father said, and there was something in his voice that Clara could not quite identify, confusion maybe, or fear. The man stepped into the light of the oil lamp, and Clara felt her breath catch. She knew him. Not well, but she knew him. His name was Matthew Cord, and he worked as a ranch hand on the Bar 7 spread about 10 miles west. She had seen him in town a handful of times, had noticed the way he carried himself with a quiet confidence that seemed at odds with his occupation. He was maybe 27 or 28, tall and lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and eyes that were such a light brown they looked almost gold in certain light. Those eyes were fixed on her face now, and she watched them darken as they took in her injuries. "Miss Brennan," he said, and his voice was low and careful, like he was trying not to spook a wounded animal. "I apologize for the intrusion at this late hour. I was hoping I might have a word with you, in private." "She has nothing to say to you," Clara's father started, but Matthew Cord did not look away from Clara's face. "I think that is for Miss Brennan to decide," Matthew said, and though his tone remained polite, there was steel underneath it. Clara did not know what was happening, but she knew an escape route when she saw one. "I will speak with him," she said, "outside." Her father looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Matthew Cord's stance made him step aside. Clara walked past him, feeling his anger radiating like heat from a stove, and stepped out onto the porch. The evening air was cool against her burning face, and she breathed it in like medicine. Matthew Cord closed the door behind them and turned to face her. Up close, she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands had curled into loose fists at his sides. "I heard what happened," he said quietly. "The whole town has heard by now. Charles Whitmore has been bragging at the saloon about how you will come around once you understand there is no other choice." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with her injuries. "And you came all the way out here to tell me that?" "No," Matthew said. "I came to tell you that there is always another choice." They stood there in the darkness, and Clara could hear the crickets singing in the grass, could smell the dust and dried grass and the faint scent of sage that always seemed to cling to cowboys who spent their days in the open country. What choice would that be, she asked, and hated how her voice shook. Matthew Cord took off his hat and held it in both hands, turning it slowly. "I have been saving my wages for 3 years," he said. "I have enough to buy a small piece of land up in Montana Territory, good grazing land near a town called Bitterroot. I was planning to head up there next month, start my own operation. It would not be easy and it would not be fancy, but it would be honest work and a free life." Clara stared at him, not understanding why he was telling her this. Matthew looked up and met her eyes. "Pack your thing," he said. "Come with me. We can leave tonight." The words hung in the air between them like something solid. Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs. "You do not even know me," she said. "I know you said no to Charles Whitmore even when it cost you everything," Matthew replied. "I know you would rather take a beating than lie about who you are. That is more than most people ever show of themselves." "You're asking me to run away with a stranger," Clara said. But even as she said it, she felt something loosening in her chest, some knot of fear and hopelessness beginning to unravel. "I am asking you to take a chance on something better than this," Matthew said, gesturing at the house behind her. "I am not asking you to marry me or make any promises. I am just offering you a way out. And once we are far enough away that you are safe, you can decide what you want to do with your life. If you want to go your own way when we get to Montana, I will help you do that. But you should not have to stay here and be bartered off like livestock just because you were born a woman in Kansas." Clara felt tears burning in her eyes, and she did not know if they were from pain or relief or the simple shock of having someone see her as a person with rights and choices. She thought about Charles Whitmore's damp hands and pale eyes. She thought about her father's belt and her mother's silence. She thought about waking up tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, trapped in a life that would slowly suffocate her. "I have nothing," she said. "No money, nothing to offer in return." "You have yourself," Matthew said. "That is enough." Clara looked back at the house, at the thin light leaking through the gaps in the door frame. She thought about going back inside, about trying to explain, about asking permission she would never receive. Then she thought about the map she had seen once in a school book, showing the vast territories to the north where the land stretched wild and open under endless sky. "How long do I have to pack?" she asked. Something that might have been a smile flickered across Matthew Cord's face. 10 minutes, he said. "Then we ride, and we do not stop until we are clear of Kansas." Clara went back inside. Her father was sitting at the table, her mother standing behind him with her hands on his shoulders. They both looked up when she entered, and she saw her father start to rise, ready to continue their argument. She did not give him the chance. "I am leaving," she said. "Do not try to stop me." She walked to the small room she shared with the quilts and memories of a childhood that felt like it belonged to someone else. She had a canvas bag that she filled with her other dress, her good shawl, the few pieces of underclothing she owned. She added her mother's ivory comb, the one pretty thing she possessed, and a small Bible that had belonged to her grandmother. Then she walked back out. Her father was standing now, blocking the door. "You are not going anywhere with that drifter," he said. "I am 22 years old," Clara said, and her voice did not shake this time. "I am leaving. You can let me walk out, or you can try to stop me, and we will see what Matthew Cord has to say about that." She saw the calculation in her father's eyes, saw him weighing his pride against the reality of a younger, stronger man waiting on the porch, pride lost. "If you walk out that door, you are no daughter of mine," he said. Clara felt the words hit her like a physical blow, but she made herself nod. "I understand," she said and walked past him. Matthew Cord was waiting with 2 horses. His was a solid bay gelding, and the other was a smaller chestnut mare with a kind eye. He took Clara's bag and tied it behind the mare's saddle, then helped Clara mount. His hands on her waist were gentle, careful of her injuries, and when she was settled, he swung up onto his own horse with easy grace. They rode away from the farmhouse at a quick trot, and Clara did not look back. She kept her eyes forward on the dark line of the horizon where the stars were beginning to emerge like scattered diamonds. Behind her, she could hear her father's voice calling her name, but the words were already fading into the distance, becoming just another sound in the prairie night. They rode hard for hours, following roads that turned to trails and then to nothing more than open country. Matthew seemed to know where he was going, steering by the stars and some internal compass that Clara did not possess. She focused on staying in the saddle, on the rhythm of the mare's stride, on the pain in her ribs that flared with each bounce. When the moon was high overhead, Matthew finally slowed and then stopped near a line of cottonwood trees that marked a creek. "We will rest here for a few hours, he said. "Let the horses drink and catch our breath." Clara slid down from the mare and immediately regretted it. Her legs nearly buckled, and Matthew was there in an instant, his hand under her elbow steadying her. "Easy," he said. "You are hurt worse than you are letting on." "I am fine," Clara said automatically, and then swayed. Matthew guided her to sit against a cottonwood trunk, then went to tend the horses. Clara watched him move in the moonlight, efficient and capable, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. 4 hours ago, she had been lying on her kitchen floor, convinced her life was over. Now she was somewhere in the open country with a man she barely knew, running toward a future that was completely uncertain. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt something that might have been hope. Matthew came back with a canteen and a cloth he had wet in the creek. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her face. Clara nodded, and he knelt beside her. His touch was careful as he cleaned the dried blood from her lip and cheek, and she found herself studying his face in the moonlight. He had strong features, a straight nose that looked like it might have been broken once, and a scar through his left eyebrow that gave him a slightly roguish appearance. But his eyes were kind, and his hands were gentle, and Clara felt something shift in her chest. "Why did you really come for me?" she asked quietly. Matthew paused, the cloth still pressed to her cheek. "I told you. I heard what happened." "But why did you care?" Clara pressed. "You do not know me." Matthew sat back on his heels, studying her face. 3 months ago, I was in town buying supplies," he said. "There was a dog in the street and some boys were throwing rocks at it. Everyone else just walked by, pretending not to see. But you stopped. You put yourself between those boys and that dog, and you stared them down until they left. Then you picked up that mangy mutt like it was made of gold and carried it to the veterinarian. I know because I followed you." Clara remembered that day. Remembered the dog with its matted fur and frightened eyes. "That dog was not useful to anyone," Matthew continued. "Helping it did not gain you anything. But you did it anyway because it was the right thing to do. That told me more about who you are than 100 Sunday dinners could have." "So this is about a dog?" Clara asked, but she was almost smiling despite the pain in her face. "This is about character," Matthew said, "and the fact that I could not stand by and let something bad happen to someone good when I had the power to prevent it." They looked at each other in the darkness, and Clara felt that shift in her chest again, deeper this time, like bedrock moving. "Thank you," she said softly. Matthew nodded and stood, offering her his hand. "We should try to sleep for a few hours. I want to be riding again before dawn." He spread out a bedroll for her and took his own, a respectful distance away. Clara lay down and looked up at the stars wheeling overhead, brighter and more numerous than she had ever seen them. She thought about her mother's face as she had walked out the door, blank and carefully neutral. She thought about her brother, 12 years old and silent in his small room. She thought about the farm where she had grown up, the only life she had ever known. Then she thought about Montana Territory, about land she had never seen and a life she could barely imagine. She thought about the man lying 20 feet away who had ridden out in the darkness to offer her a choice when everyone else had tried to take her choices away. She fell asleep wondering if it was possible to fall in love with someone you barely knew, or if what she was feeling was just gratitude dressed up in fancier clothing. They rode north for 5 days, staying off the main roads as much as possible. Matthew said it was unlikely that anyone would follow them, but he did not want to take chances. Clara's father might have written her off, but Charles Whitmore's pride might drive him to do something stupid, and the banker's son had money enough to hire men who would do his work for him. The days fell into a pattern. They would rise before dawn and ride until mid-morning, then rest during the hottest part of the day and ride again until after dark. Matthew was easy company, neither too talkative nor too silent. He told her about growing up in Texas, about losing his parents to fever when he was 15, about working his way north through a series of ranch jobs until he had ended up in Kansas. He spoke about Montana like other men spoke about women they loved, describing the mountains and the valleys and the rivers that ran clear and cold from snowmelt. Clara found herself telling him things she had never told anyone about feeling trapped in her own life, about watching her friends get married one by one and feeling the walls closing in, about loving her family but knowing that love was not always enough to make a life bearable. "Do you think I'm a terrible person?" she asked on the third day, as they sat in the shade of an outcropping of red rock, sharing strips of dried beef and hard biscuits. "For leaving them?" Matthew was quiet for a moment, chewing thoughtfully. "I think you're a brave person," he said finally. "It takes more courage to leave than to stay when staying is slowly killing you. Your father will figure out how to deal with the bank, or he will not. But that is his problem to solve, not yours. You do not owe anyone your whole life just because they gave birth to you." "The preacher would say I am breaking a commandment," Clara said. "Honor thy father and mother." "The preacher is not the one who got beaten for having an opinion," Matthew replied, and there was an edge to his voice that Clara had not heard before. She looked at him more closely and saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw had tightened. "Matthew," she said carefully, "did your father hit you?" He did not answer right away, just stared out at the prairie stretching endlessly before them. "My father was a hard man," he said finally. "He believed children should be seen and not heard, and that any infraction deserved the strap. When he died, I felt sad that I was not sad. Does that make sense?" "Yes," Clara said softly. "It makes perfect sense." They sat in silence for a while, two people bound by the understanding that sometimes family was the last place you found love and safety. Clara realized that what she felt for Matthew was deepening into something more complex than gratitude. She liked the way he thought, the way he saw the world. She liked his quiet strength and his unexpected gentleness. She liked the way he never made her feel weak for being hurt or stupid for not knowing how to read a trail. On the 5th night, they camped near a river that Matthew said marked the northern edge of Kansas. Tomorrow they would cross into Nebraska territory, and they would be truly beyond reach. "Once we are across that river, you can breathe easier," Matthew said as they sat by a small fire, watching the flames dance against the darkness. "Charles Whitmore has no reach up here." "What happens when we get to Montana?" Clara asked. She had been wondering this for days, but had been afraid to voice the question. Matthew poked at the fire with a stick, sending up a spray of sparks. "I find the land I want to buy and make an offer. If it is accepted, I start building a cabin and some corrals. I buy a small herd to start with, maybe 20 head of cattle, and hope they survive the winter. I work harder than I have ever worked in my life and pray that it is enough." "And me?" Clara asked quietly. Matthew looked up at her, and the firelight made his eyes look more gold than brown. That depends on what you want, he said. Like I told you, I'm not expecting anything from you, Clara. If you want to find work in town, I will help you get settled. If you want to move on to somewhere else, I will stake you the money to do it. Or... He stopped, and Clara felt her heart begin to hammer. Or, she prompted. Or you could stay, Matthew said. Not as my wife, not unless that is what you wanted, but as my partner. Help me build something. It would be hard work, and there would be times we would not be sure we would make it, but it would be ours, built on choices we made freely. Clara stared at him across the fire, and something slotted into place in her chest like a key turning in a lock. You would do that? She asked. Share everything equally with someone you barely know? I am getting to know you, Matthew said, and everything I learn makes me think it would be the best partnership I could ask for. I do not know anything about running a ranch, Clara said, but she was leaning forward now, unable to help herself. Neither do I, Matthew admitted with a slight smile. I know how to work on one, but running one is different. We would figure it out together. People would talk, Clara said. A man and woman living together without marriage. Let them talk, Matthew said. We will be too busy surviving to care. Clara thought about it, about what he was offering. It was not a proposal of marriage, not a declaration of love. It was something better than that. It was an offer of respect, of partnership, of a life built on mutual choice rather than obligation or expectation. I want to stay, she said. I want to help you build something. The smile that spread across Matthew's face was like sunrise. Then we will build it together, he said. They crossed the river the next morning, and the horses splashed through water that ran cold and clear over smooth stones. On the far bank, Clara turned and looked back at Kansas, at the life she was leaving behind. She felt a small pang of sorrow for what might have been, for the family she had lost, but mostly she felt relief, and beneath that, a growing excitement for what lay ahead. They continued north through Nebraska territory, following the trail that would eventually lead them up through Wyoming and into Montana. The landscape changed as they traveled, the flat prairies giving way to rolling hills, and then to the first hints of mountains in the distance. The air grew cooler, especially at night, and Matthew began to point out landmarks and tell stories about the country they were passing through. They met other travelers on the trail, mostly freight wagons and groups of settlers heading west. Matthew was friendly but careful, never volunteering too much information about where they were going or why. Clara understood the caution and was grateful for it. Out here, you never knew who might be connected to whom, who might send word back down the trail to Kansas about a young woman traveling with a cowboy. 3 weeks into their journey, they stopped for supplies in a small town called Broken Bow. It was hardly more than a dozen buildings clustered around a crossroads, but it had a general store and a livery stable and a boarding house that advertised hot meals. We should stay the night, Matthew said, looking at the boarding house with longing. A real bed and a hot bath would do us both good. Clara agreed, and they paid for 2 rooms and a meal. The proprietor was a heavy-set woman named Mrs. Carlson, who looked at Clara's fading bruises with knowing eyes, but asked no questions. She served them beef stew and fresh bread, and Clara thought it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. After dinner, Clara went upstairs to her room and found that Mrs. Carlson had left a basin of hot water and a bar of lavender soap. She stripped off her dusty clothes and washed for the first time in weeks, scrubbing away the trail dirt and the last remnants of Kansas. When she was clean, she put on her other dress, the good one she had been saving, and brushed out her hair until it shone. She was not sure why she was taking such care with her appearance. She only knew that something was shifting between her and Matthew, something that went beyond partnership or friendship. She felt it in the way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, in the way his hand lingered when he helped her dismount, in the long conversations they had under the stars about everything and nothing. There was a knock on her door, and when she opened it, Matthew stood in the hallway. He had cleaned up too, shaving away weeks of trail stubble and putting on a clean shirt. He looked younger without the beard, and Clara found herself staring at his mouth, at the curve of his lips. I was wondering if you might want to take a walk, Matthew said. There is a full moon tonight, and Mrs. Carlson says there is a nice path along the creek." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice, and they went downstairs and out into the cool evening air. The moon was indeed full, hanging fat and silver over the town, bright enough to cast shadows. They walked side by side along a path that wound between willow trees, listening to the murmur of water over stones. "Clara," Matthew said after a while, and something in his tone made her stop and turn to face him. "I need to be honest with you about something." Clara felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. "All right?" Matthew took a deep breath. "When I came to your farm that night, I told you I was just offering you a way out. I told you I did not expect anything from you. That was true. But what I did not say is that I have been watching you for months, ever since the day with the dog. I have been noticing you in town, noticing the way you move through the world with kindness, even when the world has not been kind to you. When I heard what happened, I did not ride out there just because it was the right thing to do. I rode out there because I could not stand the thought of you being hurt." He stopped, and Clara could see him struggling with the words. "What I am trying to say," Matthew continued, "is that my feelings for you have gone beyond partnership or friendship. I am falling in love with you, Clara Brennan. Maybe I have been falling for months without realizing it. And I know that is not fair because you did not ask for that. And I promised I would not expect anything from you, but I cannot keep pretending that what I feel is purely practical." Clara stared at him, her heart beating so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. In the moonlight, he looked vulnerable in a way she had never seen him, like he had just handed her something precious and breakable and was waiting to see if she would treat it gently. "Matthew," she said softly and stepped closer to him, "I have been falling too. I did not want to say anything because I thought maybe it was just gratitude, or just proximity, or just the strangeness of running away together. But it is not any of those things, or maybe it is all of those things and more besides. All I know is that when I think about building a life in Montana, I cannot imagine doing it with anyone but you." She watched the relief and joy spread across his face like dawn. He reached out and cupped her cheek with one rough, gentle hand, and she leaned into the touch. "Can I kiss you?" he asked. And Clara loved that he asked, loved that even now he was giving her the choice. "Yes," she said, and rose up on her toes to meet him halfway. The kiss was soft and careful at first, mindful of her still healing lip. But then Clara's hands were in his hair, and his arms were around her waist, pulling her close, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like a promise. They stood there in the moonlight, two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, and kissed like they were trying to make up for all the kisses they had not shared yet. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said. "I want to court you properly, give you time to be sure this is what you want. I want to marry you, Clara, but only when you are ready. Only when you are certain." "I am certain," Clara said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "I know it has only been a few weeks, but I am certain. You have shown me more respect and kindness in that time than anyone else has in my entire life. You see me for who I am, not who you want me to be. That is all I have ever wanted." "Then marry me," Matthew said, pulling back to look into her eyes. "We can find a preacher in the next town, or wait until we get to Montana, whatever you prefer. But be my wife, Clara. Build this life with me not just as my partner, but as the woman I love." Clara felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but they were good tears, happy tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." They kissed again, and this time it was celebration, a sealing of promises made under a wide western sky. When they finally walked back to the boarding house hand in hand, Clara felt like she was floating. She had left Kansas with nothing but a canvas bag and a world of hurt. Now she had something she had never dared to hope for, a man who loved her for exactly who she was, and a future built on freedom and choice. They found a preacher in the next town, a kind-faced circuit rider who asked no questions about why they were in such a hurry. He married them in a small church with Mrs. Carlson and a passing stranger as witnesses, and Clara wore a crown of wildflowers that Matthew had picked that morning. She had never felt more beautiful or more loved than she did standing in that simple church, promising to love and honor a man who had already proven he would do the same for her. That night, in a room above a saloon in a town whose name Clara never learned, Matthew made love to her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. He was patient and careful, mindful of her inexperience, and when she cried out his name in pleasure and surprise, he held her close and whispered words of love against her skin. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, and Clara traced the scars on his chest with gentle fingers. "Tell me about these," she said softly. Matthew caught her hand and brought it to his lips. "That one is from a longhorn that objected to being branded. That one is from a barbed wire fence I tried to jump when I was 17 and stupid. That one is from my father's belt buckle." Clara kissed the last scar, a thin white line just above his heart. "He cannot hurt you anymore," she said. "No," Matthew agreed, "and no one will ever hurt you again either. I promise you that, Clara. I will protect you with everything I have." "I know," Clara said, and meant it. She felt safe in a way she had never felt before, like she had finally found the place where she belonged. They continued north, but now they traveled as husband and wife, and everything felt different. The landscape seemed brighter, the future more certain. They talked about the cabin they would build, about where they would place the windows to catch the morning sun, about the chickens Clara wanted to raise and the garden she would plant. They talked about children, about how many they wanted and what they would name them. They talked about growing old together, about sitting on a porch they had not built yet and watching the sunset over land they had not bought yet. 6 weeks after leaving Kansas, they crossed into Montana territory. The mountains rose before them like a promise, their peaks still white with snow even though it was late spring. Matthew pointed out the valley where he wanted to settle, a green sweep of land watered by a clear stream, sheltered from the worst winds by a line of hills. "There," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That is where we will build our life." Clara looked at the valley and felt her heart swell. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that Kansas had never been. It was possibility made tangible, hope given form in grass and water and open sky. They rode down into the valley, and Matthew dismounted to walk the land. Clara watched him bend to examine the soil, to taste the water from the stream, to sight along the hills and plan where he would place the buildings. She had never seen him look happier or more at home. "What do you think?" he asked, coming back to where she stood by the horses. "I think it is perfect," Clara said honestly. "I think we can make something wonderful here." Matthew pulled her into his arms and kissed her soundly. "We will," he said. "I promise you that." The next few months were the hardest work Clara had ever done. They bought the land from the territorial office, 160 acres for almost everything Matthew had saved. They lived in a tent while they built the cabin, working from dawn until dark every day. Matthew cut and notched the logs while Clara chinked the gaps with mud and moss. They built a simple structure, just 2 rooms to start with, but it was sturdy and tight, and when they finally spent their first night inside, Clara felt like a queen in a palace. They bought 20 head of cattle from a rancher who was moving back east, and Matthew built corrals and a small barn. Clara planted a garden and coaxed vegetables from the rocky soil. She bought chickens from a neighbor 10 miles away and set them up in a coop Matthew built beside the cabin. She learned to shoot, to ride better, to read the sky for weather. She learned the rhythm of ranch life, the endless cycle of feeding and watering and mending and building. It was exhausting work, but it was also exhilarating. Every fence post they sunk, every seed Clara planted, every calf born in the spring was a testament to what they were building together. They were creating something from nothing, and they were doing it as equals, as partners, as people who had chosen each other freely. By the end of their first year in Montana, the cabin had a second room. The herd had grown to 30 head, and Clara was pregnant. She felt the baby quicken on a cold November morning, and she stood in the doorway of their cabin with her hands on her belly and watched Matthew working in the corrals, and felt a happiness so complete it was almost painful. That evening she told him about the baby, and she watched his face transform with wonder. He dropped to his knees in front of her and pressed his ear to her stomach, listening for a heartbeat he could not possibly hear yet. And Clara ran her fingers through his hair and thought about how far they had come from that night in Kansas. "I love you," she said, and the words felt like benediction. "I love you too," Matthew said, looking up at her with eyes full of tears. "Both of you." Their son was born in early June, delivered by a midwife from the nearest town 20 miles away. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Clara thought she might not survive it. But Matthew stayed by her side the whole time, holding her hand and whispering encouragement. And when the baby finally came into the world with a lusty cry, Clara felt a surge of triumph that was almost as powerful as the love that flooded through her. They named him James, after Matthew's father, which surprised Clara until Matthew explained, "He was a hard man, and he made my childhood difficult," Matthew said, holding his tiny son with the care of someone handling something infinitely precious. "But he survived things I cannot imagine to give me a life at all. I want to honor that survival, and then do better with the name than he did." Clara understood, and she loved him even more for it. James was an easy baby, content to sleep in a basket while his parents worked, happy to be passed between them as they went about the business of running the ranch. As he grew, he became the center of their world, a constant source of joy and wonder. Clara would watch Matthew teaching their son to walk, to ride, to recognize the calls of different birds, and feel like her heart might burst with the perfection of it all. 2 years later, their daughter was born. They named her Rose, after the wild roses that grew along the creek, and she came into the world with her father's golden eyes and her mother's stubborn determination. She was fiercer than her brother, quicker to laugh and quicker to cry, and she wrapped both her parents around her tiny fingers from the moment she drew breath. The ranch grew along with their family. Matthew bought more cattle, built bigger corrals, hired a hand to help with the work. Clara's garden expanded to include fruit trees and berry bushes, and she began selling vegetables and eggs in town. They added rooms to the cabin until it was more house than cabin, a rambling structure that held their growing life comfortably. Clara sometimes thought about Kansas, about the family she had left behind. She wondered if her brother had grown into a good man, if her mother was still living, if her father ever regretted driving her away. But those thoughts came less and less frequently as the years passed, and they no longer carried the sting they once had. She had built a new family, one founded on love and respect, and that family was more real to her than the one she had been born into. When James was 6 and Rose was 4, a letter found its way to them, forwarded through several post offices. It was from Clara's brother, now 21 years old, and newly married himself. He wrote that their father had passed the previous winter, his heart giving out while he was working in the barn. Their mother was still alive but failing, and he thought Clara would want to know. Clara read the letter sitting at the kitchen table she and Matthew had built together, and she felt a complicated swirl of emotions, grief for the father who had never understood her, relief that she would never have to face his anger again, sadness for the relationship they had never managed to have. "Do you want to go back?" Matthew asked, reading over her shoulder. "Pay your respects?" Clara thought about it, about the long journey south, about standing in the cemetery where her ancestors were buried. She thought about trying to explain her life to people who would never understand why she had left. "No," she said finally. "My life is here now. My family is here." Matthew kissed the top of her head, and Clara leaned back against him, feeling his solid strength at her back. She wrote a letter to her brother, expressing her condolences and wishing him well in his marriage. She did not mention the ranch or how happy she was or any of the details of her life. It felt like those things were too precious to share with people who had never valued her. The years rolled on, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children and the slow accumulation of prosperity. The ranch became known throughout the territory as a place where honest deals could be made and good cattle could be bought. Matthew's reputation as a fair man spread, and Clara became known for her kindness and her skill with healing herbs. People came to them for advice, for help, for the simple pleasure of their company. When James was 10, a banker from town approached Matthew about expanding his operation, offering a loan at favorable terms. Matthew listened politely but declined. "I would rather grow slow and keep my independence than owe money to anyone," he said, and Clara loved him for it, for remembering where they had come from and what they had escaped. Their children grew strong and healthy, raised on hard work and unconditional love. James inherited his father's quiet steadiness and his skill with horses. Rose got her mother's fierce heart and her gift for growing things. Clara watched them play in the valley she and Matthew had claimed, and sometimes she could barely believe that this was her life, that all of this had grown from one terrible night and one brave choice. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Matthew surprised Clara by taking her on a picnic to the spot where they had first seen the valley. He had packed a basket with all her favorite foods, and they sat on a blanket and looked out over the land they had built their life on. "Do you ever regret it?" Matthew asked, reaching for her hand, "leaving everything behind to take a chance on a stranger?" Clara laughed and squeezed his hand. "Not for a single moment," she said. "You gave me back my life, Matthew. You gave me a choice when everyone else was trying to take my choices away. Everything good that has happened since that night is because you showed up on my doorstep and said, 'Pack your things.' Those might be the 3 most beautiful words anyone ever said to me." "I thought 'I love you' were the most beautiful words," Matthew teased. "Those are good too," Clara agreed, smiling. "But 'pack your things' meant freedom. It meant possibility. It meant that my life could be something other than what other people wanted it to be." Matthew pulled her close and kissed her, and she tasted salt air and sweetness and home. "I would do it again," he said. "I would ride to your door every night for the rest of my life if that was what it took to have this." "Fortunately, you only had to do it once," Clara said, and they both laughed. They sat on the blanket as the sun moved across the sky, talking about the past and the present and the future. They talked about James possibly going to school back east, about whether Rose would want to run the ranch or forge her own path. They talked about grandchildren they did not have yet, about growing old together, about all the years still stretching ahead of them. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold, Matthew stood and pulled Clara to her feet. "Dance with me," he said. And though there was no music, Clara stepped into his arms. They swayed together under the vast Montana sky, 2 people who had found each other at exactly the right moment and built something lasting from courage and choice. The valley spread out below them, green and lush and full of promise, and Clara thought about the girl she had been lying on a kitchen floor in Kansas, certain her life was over. That girl could never have imagined this moment, this man, this life. She could never have imagined that pain and fear could transform into joy and safety, that running away could actually be running towards something better. "Thank you," Clara whispered against Matthew's chest, "for seeing me, for saving me, for loving me." "Thank you for saying yes," Matthew replied, "for trusting me, for building this life with me." They held each other as the stars began to emerge, the same stars that had guided them north all those years ago. Clara thought about destiny and choice, about whether they were the same thing or different things or 2 sides of the same coin. She thought about how one moment of courage could change the entire trajectory of a life. But mostly she just felt grateful for the man in her arms and the children sleeping safe in their home and the land that had given them a place to belong. She felt grateful for the beating that had driven her away, and the cowboy who had shown up to offer her a different path. She felt grateful for every hard choice, and every moment of doubt, and every mile of trail that had led her here, to this moment, to this man, to this life. "I love you," she said, and the words were a prayer and a promise and a celebration all at once. "I love you too," Matthew said. "Today and always." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, toward the light spilling from the windows and the sound of their children's laughter and the life they had built from nothing but determination and love. Behind them, the valley settled into darkness, but ahead was warmth and light and home. Clara Brennan Cord had left Kansas with nothing but bruises and a broken heart. She had arrived in Montana with nothing but hope and a man who believed in her. Now, 10 years later, she had everything that mattered. A partner who respected her, children who thrived, land that sustained them, and a future full of possibility. It was more than she had ever dreamed of back when dreaming seemed like a luxury she could not afford. It was more than she had dared to hope for when she had climbed onto a horse in the darkness and ridden away from everything she had ever known. It was, she thought, as she stepped into the warmth of their home, exactly what love was supposed to be. Not a prison or a transaction or a duty, but a choice made freely every single day. A partnership built on respect and trust, and the simple, profound decision to build something beautiful together. Years continued to flow like the creek that watered their valley, each season bringing new challenges and new joys. James grew into a young man who looked so much like his father that it sometimes took Clara's breath away. At 18, he announced his intention to go to the university in Helena to study veterinary medicine. Clara and Matthew supported his choice, even though it meant he would be gone for months at a time. Rose, at 16, had no interest in leaving the ranch. She had inherited her parents' love of the land and had a natural gift for understanding cattle. She could gentle a wild horse faster than anyone Clara had ever seen, and she had opinions about every aspect of ranch management that she was not shy about sharing. Matthew often joked that she would run the place better than he did, and Clara suspected he was right. When Clara was 44, her mother passed away in Kansas. This time, Clara made the journey back, taking Rose with her. It was strange to see the farm after so many years, to walk through rooms that seemed smaller than she remembered. Her brother was kind, his wife welcoming, but Clara felt like a stranger in the place where she had grown up. On the last day, she visited her parents' graves and stood there trying to feel something more than a distant sadness. "I forgive you," she said finally to her father's headstone, and realized it was true. She had built such a good life that there was no room left for bitterness. Back in Montana, Matthew met them at the train station with a wagon and a smile. Clara fell into his arms like she had been gone years instead of weeks, and he held her tight. "Welcome home," he whispered against her hair, and Clara felt the truth of it settle into her bones. Home was not the place you were born. Home was the place you chose, the people you loved, the life you built with your own hands and heart. More years passed. James came home from university with his degree and a pretty young teacher named Sarah who looked at him like he hung the moon. They married in the spring and built a house on the edge of the ranch property, and James opened a veterinary practice in town. Within 2 years, Clara and Matthew became grandparents to twin boys with Sarah's dark hair and James's golden eyes. Rose waited until she was 23 before she fell in love, and when she did, it was with a quiet cowboy named Thomas who worked on a neighboring ranch. He reminded Clara of Matthew in the way he spoke carefully and worked hard and looked at Rose like she was something precious. They married and built their own house on the opposite side of the ranch, and Rose slowly began taking over more of the management, just as Matthew had predicted. Clara and Matthew found themselves with more time for each other as their children built their own lives. They took long rides through the valley, just the two of them. Remembering their first days in Montana, they sat on the porch in the evenings watching the sun paint the mountains gold, holding hands like courting sweethearts. "Did you ever think we would make it this far?" Clara asked one evening when she was 52 and Matthew was 57. Matthew considered the question seriously. "I hoped we would," he said, "but hope and certainty are different things. I knew that first night that you were special, that helping you was the right thing to do. I did not know that you would become the center of my entire world." "You saved my life," Clara said, not for the first time. "You saved mine right back," Matthew replied, also not for the first time. I was drifting before I met you, just working and saving money without any real purpose. You gave me a reason to build something lasting. You made me want to be the kind of man who deserved you." "You were always that man," Clara said. "You just needed someone to see it." They rocked in their chairs as the light faded, comfortable in the silence that came from decades of partnership. Clara thought about the girl she had been, beaten and desperate, on a Kansas floor. She thought about the fear and the uncertainty and the wild courage it had taken to climb on a horse and ride away into the unknown. She thought about all the moments that had brought her to this porch, this man, this life. The good moments and the hard moments and the ordinary moments that somehow added up to something extraordinary. Rose gave birth to a daughter that winter, a tiny thing with Clara's dark hair and her father's steady temperament. They named her Clara, after her grandmother, and when Clara held her namesake for the first time, she cried tears of joy so profound that Matthew had to take the baby before she dropped her. "You have made me so happy," Clara told her daughter through her tears. "All of you. I never knew it was possible to be this happy." Rose hugged her mother tight. "You taught me what love should look like," she said. "You and Papa showed me that marriage should be a partnership, that respect matters as much as affection. I will teach my Clara the same things." The ranch prospered under Rose's management, growing into one of the most successful operations in the territory. Montana achieved statehood in 1889, and Matthew and Clara attended the celebration in Helena, marveling at how much had changed since they had first arrived. The wild frontier they had settled was slowly being tamed, but their valley remained as beautiful and wild as ever. When Clara was 61, she fell ill with pneumonia. It was touch and go for a while, and there were nights when Matthew sat by her bedside convinced he was going to lose her. But Clara was tough, forged in hardship and strengthened by love, and she fought her way back to health. The illness changed her, though, made her more aware of time passing and the preciousness of every moment. She began writing down her story, wanting her grandchildren and great-grandchildren to know where they came from and what it had taken to build the life they enjoyed. She wrote about Kansas and the beating and the choice she had made. She wrote about Matthew showing up like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to pray. She wrote about the long ride north and falling in love under the stars and building a cabin with their own hands. She wrote about their children and their grandchildren and the life they had created together. When she finished, she showed the pages to Matthew, nervous about what he would think. He read them carefully, his eyes growing misty in places, and when he looked up at her, his expression was tender. "You should share this," he said. "Other women need to know that there are choices, that they do not have to accept lives that hurt them." But Clara shook her head. "I wrote it for our family," she said. "To remember, to understand." Matthew accepted that, and the pages went into a wooden box where they were saved for future generations. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The cabin they had built now expanded into a proper ranch house that could hold them all. There was food and music and dancing, and Clara waltzed with Matthew under the same stars that had guided them north all those decades ago. 40 years, Matthew said, holding her close. "It went faster than I expected." "We fit a lot of living into those years," Clara said. "We did," Matthew agreed, "and I would do every single one of them over again exactly the same way." "Even the hard parts?" Clara asked. "Especially the hard parts," Matthew said, "because they taught us what we were made of, and they made the good parts even better." Clara laid her head on his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. She thought about how strange and wonderful life was, how one moment of courage could ripple out into decades of happiness. She thought about the girl who had refused to marry a man she did not love, and the man who had shown up to offer her a different choice. She thought about how love was not always lightning strikes and grand gestures. Sometimes it was quiet moments and steady presence, and 40 years of choosing the same person every single day. "I love you," she said into the fabric of his shirt. "I love you too," Matthew replied, and she felt the words rumble in his chest. "Thank you for packing your things." Clara laughed, delighted that he remembered. "Thank you for giving me a reason to." They danced until the stars wheeled overhead, and their grandchildren began to fall asleep in corners, and their children started gathering up belongings to head home. They stood on the porch and waved goodbye, Matthew's arm around Clara's waist, and watched the wagons roll away into the darkness. "Just us again," Matthew said. "Just us," Clara agreed, and it was enough. It had always been enough. They lived 10 more good years, growing old together with grace and gratitude. They watched their grandchildren grow and their great-grandchildren be born. They saw Montana change and modernize, but their valley remained their sanctuary, the place where they had built everything that mattered. When Matthew passed at 77 quietly in his sleep after a good day working with the horses, Clara grieved but did not shatter. He had given her 50 years of love and partnership, and she carried that gift with her as she continued living. She remained active in ranch management, advising Rose and playing with great-grandchildren and tending her garden. She lived to be 84 years old, dying peacefully on a spring morning with Rose holding one hand and James holding the other. Her last words were, "Tell your father I am coming," and she left the world with a smile on her face. They buried her next to Matthew on a hill overlooking the valley they had claimed together. The headstone was simple: Clara Brennan Cord, 1856 to 1940, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. Chosen, not given. Rose made sure that Clara's written story was preserved and shared, and it became a treasured family heirloom. Her grandchildren and great-grandchildren read it and marveled at the courage it had taken to leave everything behind for an uncertain future. They read about the beating and the desperate escape and the long ride north, and they understood that their comfortable lives had been built on one woman's refusal to accept less than she deserved. The ranch continued for generations, passed down through Rose's line and then her daughter Clara's line and beyond. The original cabin where Matthew and Clara had spent their first Montana winter was preserved as a historical site, and people came from all over to see where two young people had started building something extraordinary from nothing but love and determination. But the real legacy was not the land or the buildings or even the story written in fading ink. The real legacy was the understanding that love should be a choice freely made, that partnership meant respect and equality, that no one should have to sacrifice who they were to be loved. Clara had left Kansas beaten and broken, convinced her life was over. She had climbed onto a horse not knowing where she was going, only knowing she could not stay where she was. She had trusted a cowboy who saw her worth when no one else did, and together they had built something that lasted long after they were gone. It was, in the end, a simple story. A woman refused to be sold. A man offered her a choice. They took a chance on each other and built a life that honored both of them. They loved each other through hard times and good times, through back-breaking work and quiet evenings, through raising children and burying parents, and watching the world change around them. They chose each other every day for 50 years, and that choice rippled out into generations of love and strength and freedom. It was proof that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is pack your things and ride toward an uncertain future. Sometimes the greatest love stories start not with a fairy tale, but with 3 simple words spoken in darkness: pack your things. And sometimes, if you are very lucky and very brave, those 3 words lead to everything you never knew you needed, everything you never dared to dream, everything that makes a life worth living. Clara and Matthew found that life together, built it with their own hands, and left it behind as a gift for everyone who came after. It was a legacy of love chosen freely, of partnership built on respect, of courage rewarded with happiness that lasted a lifetime and beyond. The valley still stands in Montana, green and beautiful and wild. The creek still runs clear and cold from mountain snowmelt. The descendants of Matthew and Clara's cattle still graze the hills, and roses still bloom wild along the water's edge. The land remembers the two young people who claimed it and loved it and built something lasting there. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispers through the grass and the stars emerge like scattered diamonds, you can almost hear it. The echo of hoofbeats heading north. The sound of two hearts beating in tandem, the whispered words that changed everything. Pack your things. 3 words that meant freedom. 3 words that meant hope. 3 words that led to 50 years of love and a legacy that would never fade. 3 perfect words.